So everybody has words or phrases that people associate with them. We all do that. We all have certain words that we like to use. I mean, famous people have certain phrases. I used to grow up watching cooking shows, and a guy named Emeril Lagasse would do stuff and he'd go, bam, and that was his catchphrase. We all have these different words that we like, and when you talk to somebody, you know that they're going to say that phrase almost every time you have a conversation. I have lots of words that I like. One of them is dude. I say dude for everybody. Male or female, it doesn't matter. And I didn't even grow up in California on the beach. I grew up in Tulsa. I don't know why. That's just one of my words. I love the word why. I ask that question all the time because at the root, I'm lazy and I don't want to do anything without a good reason. Why? One of the other words that I really love is intentional. I love the word intentional because it means you're doing something for a reason. And that word goes right along with another word I like, which is mission. Living on mission. Those are great words. And when I think of the idea of intentional and mission, I realize that they go together. And whenever I think about the word intentional, what I often do is I think about the times in my life that I was not intentional. Like this. You know when you have that rare Saturday where you have nothing going on, and you say to your spouse on Friday, well, we'll figure out what we're going to do tomorrow. And then Saturday afternoon rolls around, and you realize you've done nothing. Like you haven't done any of the stuff you needed to do. You didn't go do any of the stuff you wanted to do. You did nothing because you were not intentional. And when I think of that word, I think of the negative times in my life when I have done that. But you see, that's why intentionality is so important. That's why it is so important. It moves us from where we are to where we need to be. Now, I bet everyone here knows somebody who has no intentionality in their life. If it's that person next to you, do not look at them. I say that all the time. They have no intentionality. That means they have no goals. They have no aspirations. Basically, they're kind of, their life is kind of like a bump on a log. And they're not going anywhere. And maybe I'm a little harsh whenever I think about it. And I think to myself, what is wrong with you? Why don't you care? Why don't you want to do anything? Is this really what you want to do, with your life? You're not going to accomplish anything with your life. That's what I think about people with no intentionality. But then I realized, as I was thinking about that may be exactly what God is thinking about me sometimes. He might be looking at my life and he's thinking, you only have this one life to reach as many people as you can for me. Is this all you're going to do? Is that it? You're just going to be a bump on a log? You don't care about reaching people more than that? That's all you're going to do? I mean, are you going to actually accomplish anything that matters in your life? I think sometimes maybe God is looking at me and thinking that because so often I lack intentionality. As usual, I'm preaching this sermon to myself because if you're like me, through this whole COVID thing and social distancing and all this other stuff, I've kind of lacked some motivation in some ways. Maybe you've been there too. This whole thing kind of drains motivation, and I've realized that my intentionality has gone right along with it, right down the drain. I haven't been as intentional as I need to be, and I've allowed other things to take priority. You see, I've allowed excuses to override reality because of that, and that's what a lot of us have done. We've pulled back and we haven't been intentional. And I need to be reminded that even though I think other things are more important, there is nothing more important than being intentional as a Christian because everything else is just temporary. I need to choose to look and to act like a disciple. Let me read you a story. A man was looking for a job and he noticed that there was an opening at the local zoo. He inquired about the position, about the job, and discovered that the zoo had a very unusual position that they wanted to fill. Apparently, the gorilla had died. And until they could get a new one, they needed someone to dress up in a gorilla suit and act like a gorilla for a few days. I got some kids that could do that. He was just to sit, eat, and sleep. His identity would be kept a secret, of course, and thanks to a very fine gorilla suit, no one would be the wiser. The zoo offered good pay for this job, so the man decided to do it. He tried on the suit, and sure enough, he looked just like a gorilla. They led him to the cage, and he took a position at the back of the cage and pretended to sleep. But after a while, he got tired of sitting, so he walked around a little bit. He jumped up and down and tried a few gorilla noises. The people who were watching him seemed to really like that. And when he would move or jump around, they would clap and cheer and throw him peanuts. And the man loved peanuts. So he jumped around some more and he tried climbing a tree. That seemed to really get the crowd excited. They threw more peanuts. So playing to the crowd, this guy grabs a vine and he swung from one side of the cage to the other. The people loved it and they threw more peanuts. Wow, this is great, he thought. He swung higher and the crowd grew bigger. He continued to swing on the vine, getting higher and higher, and then all of a sudden the vine broke. He swung up and out of the cage, landing in the lion's cage that was next door. He panicked. There was a huge lion not 20 feet away, and it looked very hungry. So the man in the gorilla suit started jumping up and down, screaming and yelling, "Help, help, get me out of here. I'm not really a gorilla. I'm a man in a gorilla suit. Help!" The lion quickly pounced on the man, held him down, and said, "Will you shut up or you're going to get us both fired?" The question is, what am I? Am I a Jesus follower? Am I a disciple of his or not? And many of us pretend to be Jesus followers, but eventually the truth will come out. Eventually the truth comes out. And here's the difference between a real follower and disciple of Jesus and a fake one. It's what we're going to look at today. It's being intentional in our lives. That's the difference, is being intentional with what God has given us. You see, real disciples live on mission. So let's look at what this looks like in the life of Jesus. Jesus was first and foremost intentionally focused. This is what he did. He knew where he was going. He knew that he was going to die for our sins, but he had a mission on the way. It's no different than any of us. We are all going to die. I hate to break it to you, but we are going to. We are all going to die someday, but we have a mission on the way. And Jesus modeled living this mission all the way to the cross. You see, he was driving towards something. I want you to think about this for a minute. It may be sad, I don't know, but what will people say about you when you die? I mean, what are they going to say at your funeral? Are they going to say things like, "Man, there's a really nice guy, really nice lady. They had a lot of fun. They were just a really good person." You know what? That's terrible. I hope they don't say that. That would be terrible if that was the best that they could say. Here's what I hope they say. I hope they think that they say this: "They led me to Jesus. They helped me grow in my walk with God." I hope they say that there's this line of people that are lined up that want to speak at your funeral because they say, "I know that I'm going to see them in eternity because of what they did for me. They changed my life in some ways. They made a difference for God." You see, that's what we should be striving for people to say about us. That's what we want. We don't want them to just say, "They were pretty nice. That was a good person." We want people to be able to say, "They made a difference for me for eternity." And that only comes through one thing, and that is this: intentional living. Just like Jesus did. He was intentionally focused, and Jesus lived intentionally. And through that, he made sure that he had intentional words. In your handout, you'll see Luke 5 there, and there's a story, a narrative about where these friends bring a guy who is crippled to Jesus. These are amazing friends. I want you to imagine the scene. There's people all around this house. So you've got this little house. It's not very big, and just thousands of people all around. And these guys are trying to get through. They're like elbowing people, but there's 4 of them, one on each corner of the mat, I would assume, carrying their crippled friend and trying to get him to Jesus. These are some awesome friends. We all need friends like this. And they're trying to get through this crowd, and they're like, excuse me. They're elbowing people. They can't get to Jesus. So they're like, "Man, what are we going to do?" So this is another reason I like these guys. These are like some of my friends. They decide, you know what? We're going to rip up some roof. So they go up to the roof and they rip it up, and they're like, "This is the only way to get him to Jesus. This is what we're going to do." They cared that much about their friend. And they lower him down to Jesus. I can only imagine Jesus standing there and he's speaking and stuff's falling on his head. I mean, this is a thatch type roof almost. Stuff's falling on his head. He's like, what's going on? You know, and he's looking around and then everybody there just sees this mat being lowered into the room. And then this is what happens. So he's lowered down right in front of Jesus. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." That's not why that guy came. That's not why they were there. But you see, Jesus had intentional words. He knew what was going to happen from this. He also knew what this guy really needed. He thought he needed healing, but what he needed was forgiveness. But Jesus had intentional words here because he knew what was getting ready to happen next. At this, it says this: the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts?" I would have loved to have been there. Have you ever thought something and then you said it out loud and didn't realize you actually said it out loud? And you're like, did I just say that out loud? I think that's what the Pharisees are thinking here. They're like, did I just say that? Or was I just thinking it? And Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he continues with his intentional words, and he says this: which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up and walk"? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up and take your mat and go home." Immediately stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on, and went home praising God. And everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." You see, Jesus was intentional with what he said to make a point that no one would ever forget. You see, what we say matters. How we say it matters. And what words are you intentionally saying? What words are you intentionally saying to people? What are you saying to people about your faith in God? I'm not going to embarrass you and have you raise your hand, but I would be very interested in how many people in this room have actually shared their faith with someone over the last year or two. Like, what are we saying to people about our faith? I mean, what are you saying intentionally about other people? You see, what we are saying intentionally to our kids to build them up as God's followers, what are we saying to them first and foremost? How are we building up our kids to do that? This week, I want us to look at how are we intentionally speaking and how does that move people to God? You see, words matter. But Jesus was also intentional about where he went. John 4:4 says this: now he had to go through Samaria. He had to go through Samaria. And this is very interesting. We've got a map that we're going to pull up. And I've talked about this before. And I get to use my pointer too. And so Jesus, Jerusalem area, he's like, I have to go up through Samaria. That's not what they did. Most Jews would go over the river and through the woods and up to here. And they would come back into Galilee. So they'd go over because they didn't want to go through Samaria. They hated Samaritans. Samaritans were half-breeds, half Jews, half Gentiles. That was worse than a full Gentile. So most of them would go around. Where's my thing? There you go. Most of them would go around. Jesus says, I have to go through Samaria, which is really weird. The disciples are like, you don't have to go through there, Jesus. Why are we doing that? But he goes, I have to. He goes through there, and in Samaria is where we see Jesus run into the woman at the well. And I'm not going to give you that whole story, but basically Jesus talks to her, and then she goes, grabs everybody in town, and they all come and hear about Jesus. And all this whole area has an opportunity now to be saved because Jesus had to go to Samaria. He had to go there. He changed an entire town, an entire community, and all of these lives. So where do we go and spend time at? Where do we spend our time? How are we intentionally about being present? Where do we go to make a difference? If we are only around church people all the time, we will not be bringing people to Jesus. Jesus says, I had to go there. I had to go and see the people that don't know me. He had to go. See, where do we go to make a difference? And I'll be honest, you may not have known this. You cannot make a difference at home binge watching Netflix, all right? I know that's hard to believe. Now, that doesn't mean that never happens, but you're not going to make a difference. That is not living intentionally. That is not living like a disciple. So Jesus was intentional about his words, intentional about where he went. He was also intentional about his actions. Luke 5:12-13 says this. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Man, I probably talk about this encounter as much as anything because it is so amazing what Jesus did. He didn't just heal the guy, he touched the man. That's the miracle as much as anything in this whole thing. This man may have not felt human touch in years because he had leprosy. Nobody would touch him. And that's what Jesus did, his actions. He showed the man what love is. We don't understand this very well because we don't have a lot of lepers running around. Imagine this. Imagine you're walking, in the Walmart at Springfield right there. You know which one I'm talking about, right there on the corner, and there's all these homeless people around. And you see one coming up to you, and you can smell them a mile away. And they're dirty. You know they haven't had a bath in a long, long time. And there's bugs probably all over them, and they're just really gross. And they come up to you, and they say, hey, can I have $1? And what you do is this. You open your arms, and you go, I'll give you $1, but I want to give you a hug first. Man, that's what Jesus did here. That's what he did when he touched that leper. His actions changed hearts. His actions changed minds. And what he did was even more because not only would it physically be kind of gross to touch a leper with all the stuff going on there, but because of the look of society, how they looked at them, you just didn't do those things. So he didn't just want to heal, he wanted to change the ideals of society. So how are we intentional in our actions? What do we do that shows love and changes people's thinking? And if we're intentional like Jesus was in his actions, then we're going to see in our lives what happens a couple verses later. Luke 5:15. This is literally 2 verses later. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. Now, obviously, we may not be able to heal, but they came to hear him. They came to hear about the guy who touches lepers. They came to hear about the persons whose actions in life are so different. They wanted to know about the Messiah, and our intentional actions can create the exact same thing. Our intentional actions will be moving people to want to know Jesus. That's why it's so important to live on mission. So not only was he intentional with his actions, but he's also used every interaction as an intentional teaching opportunity. You see, Jesus was intentionally training those who would carry on. Specifically, it was his disciples. Mark 4 says this. With many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything to them. So he would tell these stories and they would be like, I don't get it, Jesus. I mean, Jesus didn't pick necessarily all the smartest guys. All right? These were not necessarily Rhodes Scholars, all right? And they're just like, I don't get it. And Jesus said, all right, let me explain it to you. Again, he would explain it because he is trying to teach them. It's very similar to maybe what you've done in your life where you've done an action and maybe with your kids or grandkids or somebody else and you explained why. I've done that lots of times with my kids, not necessarily intentionally, but I should. But the time where you give back extra change that was given to you in the store and your kids see you do that. The time where you stop to help somebody. I've told the story before. I stopped and helped a couple one Sunday morning with the 2 boys with me, and they've never forgotten that story, and they weren't very old. They were young, and they've never forgotten the time that we stopped and helped the couple. And then I explained to them later why we do those things. Maybe you've done that before. Maybe you turn in something after you found it instead of keeping it. We were at a grocery store one time, and we found an envelope with like $400 or $500 in it. I knew what it was. Somebody had cashed probably a Social Security check because of where we were at, and they dropped their envelope. And we found it, the boys and I, and we turned it in to the store manager. I said, somebody's going to be looking for this. And the boys were like, well, there's no name on it. You don't know whose that is. I go, well, I know it's not mine. That's what I know. And so I explained to them why we were doing what we were doing so that I could be intentionally making disciples. They're always going to remember those stories. They're always going to remember that. And when I have an intentional life, I am training up people around me to be Jesus followers. I say to my boys all the time, I say, when you are leading in a church, whatever that looks like, this is what you should be doing. This is what that should look like when you are leading in the church. Because I have to be intentional to produce the next generation of leaders for God. And that's what Jesus was always doing. I mean, he was looking for discussions all the time. Mark 8, I love this. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? He asked this open-ended question because he really wanted a discussion going. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you, he said. Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. He asked them questions to get them thinking so they would have their own faith. I have one goal in life. I have one goal, that's it. One goal in life. That is for my boys to have intentional faith. For them to have their own faith and for them to own it. That is the only thing that matters. Is that I have passed on. That is my first responsibility. And I have to be intentional like Jesus was to strengthen that faith and understanding. How am I doing that same thing with people around me? How am I intentional about teaching and looking for encounters and teaching moments? That is the real question. How are we intentional? And here is the big key that keeps us from being intentional. This is the key for us to be intentional in our life, and it's this. It's really weird. We have to embrace the awkward. We have to embrace the awkward. I'll be honest, I really like awkward situations. I really do. Like if things are really weird for everybody in the room, it makes me really enjoy that a lot. I know it's very strange and weird, but the weirder something is, the more I enjoy it. When we went out to, have any of you ever been to Venice Beach? Has anybody ever been to Venice Beach? That place is weird. It is awesome. And on it, there's actually a place to go where they filmed a show called Freak Show. And that's what it is. It's all these weird things. And my wife and I went, I'm like, oh, I'm in. I need to see some weird stuff. I love awkward. I love weird. But I realize I like that in certain areas, but I don't embrace the awkward enough to live intentionally. Because I'll be honest, if you're living intentionally, there's going to be some awkward things. There's going to be awkward conversations. There's going to be awkward feelings. There's going to be awkward relationships. But see, that's what happens when we live intentionally. And Jesus had all kinds of awkward conversations. I mean, he's calling the Pharisees, dogs or whatever it is. And he's talking to this person that's clearly just a sinner, a bad sinner. And he's like, love you, you're good. And people are going, what? What's going on? It was awkward. It was weird. He had all kinds of awkward and weird responses and thoughts from people. You see, he was living intentionally, and that means things may get weird. Things are going to get weird when you live intentionally. And I get it. Being on mission is tough for us. It is strange for us. And it can make for those awkward discussions that we often would prefer not to have. Some people don't want to be in those strange situations. It makes your heart beat fast. It makes you a little scared. You're not sure what to say, and you're not sure what they're going to say. And you think to yourself, it would just be better if I didn't say anything at all. I don't want to ask them about this. I mean, and many people don't like being asked about what they believe. I mean, have you ever noticed that? Some people are like, when you ask them what they believe, they go, I don't want to be asked that. Here's why. Here's why people don't want to be asked what they believe. And here's the first one, is because many people don't have any idea what they believe. And you've just put them on the spot. Now they have to come up with a reason why they've never thought of anything beyond this life. God's real. I guess. They've never really thought about it. That's why they don't want to be asked what their worldview is or their belief system, because they don't have one. They are literally just drifting. They're not being intentional. They don't want to seem like they haven't thought about anything deeply. Another reason people don't like that question is because too many people don't want to offend you. If you ask somebody what they believe, you know what they're going to do? They're going to look at you and go, I wonder what they believe. What is the right answer here? What should I say? Why are they asking me this? They don't want to offend you, and they don't know where you stand necessarily, and they don't want to feel rejected, so people may not want to answer about their beliefs. Let me tell you, I've told you what my approach is. When I am being intentional and asking somebody where they're at and trying to get to a spiritual conversation, I always ask this question: where are you with this God thing? Where are you with this God thing? And that allows a couple options. I've already said, I state the God. The options are, I don't believe in God at all. That's fine. That's a great starting place. We can go from there. Or they say, you know what, I believe in God. That's a great starting place too, because then it's like, well, if there's a God, he has expectations. Many of us are scared of this. Many of us are scared. If I'm intentional, they're going to say, I don't believe in God at all. That's fine. Now you know where they're at. And then here's the question you ask is, why is that? And here's what they're going to say. 2 reasons. They're going to say, I don't believe in God, and they're going to tell you a story about a time something bad happened to them or a loved one. And they're going to say, if God loved us, man, he wouldn't do that. He would never have allowed that to happen if he truly loved us. That's going to be one thing that they might say. And the other thing that they might say is this. Well, I believe that science and creation, and this is how everything got started, and they may have a false understanding of how science and creation actually go together. You see, those are usually the excuses. These are usually the issues most of the time, but these conversations aren't normal for us. They're just not normal for us. I wish they were normal for me. I need to be more intentional. You know why they're not normal? It's because over years, people have tricked us. Satan's tricked us actually into this thinking. He's tricked us into thinking that our Christian walk, our relationship with God is private. Our relationship with God is not private. Our relationship with God is personal, but it is not private. It is not private at all. Other people should know, other people should hear, they should see. It is personal, but it is not private. And for us to be living intentionally, we have to embrace the awkward. I would love over the next few weeks for some of you guys to come and tell me some stories about some awkward discussions you had. And you're like, yeah, it was weird. It did not go the way I planned. You can't control that part. You just get to start the awkward. And if you do it enough, you'll be a little weird like me and begin to like the awkward. And begin to realize that you are living intentionally. You see, we've seen this amazing example of the life of Jesus. What happens when we get out of our comfort zone? And it can be scary, but it's why we are here. We are here, we are ready, like 1 Peter 3 says. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. That is what we are prepared to do and looking to do when we live intentionally. You see, living on mission is more important than anything else. And that's what should be driving us personally, and that's what should be driving us as a church. You know why it's so important? You know why it's so important to be living intentionally? I think this poem that I'm going to finish up with shows us why it is so important. The poem goes like this. My friend, I stand in judgment now and feel that you're to blame somehow. On earth, I walked with you by day and never did you show the way. You knew the Lord in truth and glory, but never did you tell the story. My knowledge then was very dim. You could have led me safe to him. Though we lived together here on earth, you never told me of the second birth. And now I stand this day condemned because you failed to mention him. You taught me many things, that's true. I called you friend and I trusted you. But I learned now that it's too late and you could have kept me from this fate. We walked by day and talked by night, and yet you showed me not the light. You let me live and love and die. You knew I'd never live on high. Yes, I called you friend in life, and trusted you throughout joy and strife. And yet, coming to this dreadful end, I cannot now call you my friend. You see, that's why intentionality is so important. That's why it is so important. We are talking about life and death. We are talking about eternity with God or not. We are called to live in intentionality just like Jesus. That is why we are here. And it's worth a little awkwardness. It's worth a little getting out of our comfort zone. It's worth being a little different in our conversations and being focused. Because it really does matter. I would hate the end of my life that somebody could read this poem back to me and say, you know what? I could have been saved if you had just been intentional with your life. You see, that's why we're here. And the first step to do that is to intentionally decide that you will give your life to Jesus. That you can't help others if you don't know the way yourself. We call that getting on base with God. The B is to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. A is to admit that I'm a sinner and I need a Savior. S is to surrender and say, God, you're in charge of every area of my life. And since I surrender to you, I will embrace the awkward. I will have those conversations because you're in charge. And E is to express that in Christian baptism. And then you can intentionally live so that you are helping others get on base with God also. And if you've already made that decision to let Jesus be the boss of your life, then here is our mission for the week. Be intentional. Be intentional. It's obvious. And that means intentional conversations, intentional actions, intentional questions. And I think we'll be surprised at how much influence that we can have on people when we are intentional. We will be surprised at how receptive people are to hear about Jesus when somebody actually asks them about him. See, we're just going to have to be willing to embrace the awkward and decide that we are going to give our lives to God and be intentionally living for him. You see, when it's all said and done, the only thing that matters is what's said and done. And God has called us to live intentionally. I pray that we will intentionally live like Jesus. And when we do, we can change the world for God. You see, that's what disciples